Hi, welcome to the next installment in AlertFind's webinar series. Today we are doing an active shooter case study, Lessons in Emergency Planning and Communications. We will be live tweeting this event. You can follow it at alertfind.com. And if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, just use the hashtag AFWebinar. I am so excited to introduce you to our special guest today, Jeff Trask. Jeff Trask is an experienced emergency management professional with expertise in business continuity, disaster recovery, data center operations, and crisis response. He's worked with organizations to implement emergency preparedness and business continuity plans for more than 10 years, with experience in the financial, government, and academic sectors. He's a national certified emergency manager through the International Association of Emergency Managers and master continuity practitioner through the Federal Emergency Management Agency. He's also a FEMA certified instructor and holds instructor certificates in many emergency management related topics. I'm your moderator today, Daniela Ricci. I am the Senior Director of Marketing for AlertFind. AlertFind is an emergency management system for business continuity professionals. Today we're going to be covering using an ENS, how using an ENS enabled the emergency management team to quickly lock down a college campus and protect a campus community. The entire emergency management response was run via an emergency operations center. In-depth emergency planning helped a school respond quickly to the incident, and emergency communications, including pre-planned alerts, and how they played a key role in the emergency management response. Jeff, welcome to the call today.
Great, thank you so much. Happy to join you today. Just a note of caution: I'm recovering from a cold, so I got my mute button handy. So if I start hacking up along, I can quickly mute, but yeah, no, happy to join you today.
Jeff, we so appreciate that you are battling a cold to be here today with us. So thank you for joining us. I want to begin by asking you about your role as an emergency management administrator and what that role entails.
Yeah, so I think the role of emergency management in any of the organizations that I've worked for, including an academic one. I know we're using we're looking at a case study of an incident occurring, and how a school would prepare for that, respond to, and what it looks like from a recovery standpoint after. But emergency management organization is there basically to help communicate, facilitate, manage resources in support of the tactical boots on the ground operations and first responders. So really, it doesn't matter size or shape of the organization, anything from government, private sector, academia, nonprofit. That's really what the role is. And also managing business impact. So from a business continuity standpoint, role of the EOC is really to bring key stakeholders together to analyze what the business impact is of the incident and help to recommend strategies to manage that business impact and get people back to normal as quickly as possible. Great.
And you just mentioned working with stakeholders. I'm wondering how your emergency team, especially during the aftermath of the Boston bombing incident, which we're going to talk about today, so how your team worked with key stakeholders, including law enforcement.
Yeah. So again, looking at that as a backdrop for this discussion. Really, working with key stakeholders is incredibly important. You definitely want to build pre-disaster relationships and engage those stakeholders well in advance of any type of incident happening. You definitely don't want to meet people for the first time and work with them for the first time during the actual incident. So engaging folks within the organization, like communication specialists, human resources, law enforcement, your facilities department, your local first responders, IT. Those are all key relationships to have well in advance. Specifically with law enforcement, usually law enforcement is really the first to know when something happens. So, whatever that incident might be, it's probably the law enforcement's really going to know when something happens first. So being prepared and having a close relationship with them and support is critical to ensuring that effective and timely communication occurs during an incident.
Thanks. So I want to take us into the case study that we want to talk about for the beginning of today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing, and how you as an emergency management administrator manage that for a college campus. So I think just to refresh people's memories, this dominated the news cycle for many days. I'm sure that many of us have strong memories from this time, but I want to begin by talking about the actual the incident at the marathon and then the couple days that followed it. And what I think is really interesting about this time, and maybe you can respond to that, is that there was this big event that took place. It was big and traumatic, and but it was also isolated. And then there are a couple of days that follow it where no one really understands what they should be doing. There's a lot of panic. There's a lot of misinformation. The media is coming at this with all kinds of conspiracy theories and and information that's unvetted. So thinking about that, I want to ask you about your notification strategy, kind of during that time, like right after the bombing occurred, and then, how do you manage those couple of days, for alerting?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So obviously, when an incident like this occurs, it has impact far beyond. Obviously, where the real damage was done and the lives were lost and people were injured. Impact being that the organizations, college campuses, businesses, they're impacted because you first and foremost, you want to keep people out of harm's way. So you definitely want to get messaging out to your organization, to your community, letting them know as much as you know. I mean, I know there was a lot of confusion, miscommunications, and information was coming out in real time, and you had to respond. But first and foremost, life safety. Keep people out of the area. Not only does it keep them safe, but it also allows first responders to do their job, and obviously treat the wounded, secure the crime scene, conduct whatever investigations they need to conduct. So you want to keep people away. So I think first and foremost, post event, you're definitely going to want to communicate, messaging that tells people, where the incident is and what protective actions they can take to keep themselves safe.
Thanks. And then so I want to take people into the kind of 48 hours that followed, that period when we really, we'd experienced this traumatic event and then people didn't really know very much. All of a sudden, there was a lot of action, and there was a lockdown in the Boston area, where this incident took place. So can you take me through, as we think about this super chaotic, timeline of events, how are you alerting the people that you're trying to protect, and how are you keeping them safe, through this timeline from when the FBI identifies the suspects, through the shelter in place to when the police have finally apprehended everyone involved?
Yeah. So again, safety first, right? So you want to get as much information as possible on what the current situation is. So a lot of it's situational awareness. Again, going back to those partnerships and relationships with, with those key stakeholders, obviously law enforcement, FBI, mass emergency management. I mean, you look into all those different, officials and stakeholders to share information, provide information that you can then use to properly prepare your community and notify your community as to what's going on and to keep them safe. Obviously, a lockdown you mentioned is a tricky situation because it basically stops all movement. So you got other things to think about at that time. In addition to life safety, you're also looking at how do you keep your organization going and moving forward. If you're a college, how do you get people on campus? If you're a business, how do you get your employees to work? How do you continue to function? So those are all, considerations that you're making at this time, and you're taking whatever appropriate actions are necessary, and you're looking at different strategies to return to your operations as quickly as possible. So maybe at this time you're looking at, if you're a business, you're looking at alternatives like working from home. If folks are locked down, if the city's locked down and public transportation is offline, and that can have a serious impact on your organization. So you want to make sure that you're communicating that, and you're also communicating effective strategies to work around that situation as well.
And what's the cadence for alerting during an event like this, where there's a lot of information kind of coming all at once? How often are you sending alerts during this time?
So yeah, I mean, alerting strategy. It's obviously in the beginning when things are fresh. It's a more frequent cadence. I think, though, that it is very important to keep up a regular cadence as the situation develops. So, again, you want to establish yourself as the official source of information. Some of the challenges that you have, in this day and age with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I mean, you got so many different ways that information is disseminated out there, and if you don't, as an organization, communicate effectively and on a timely basis and on a regular basis, people kind of tend to fill in the gaps with information that is publicly available. So you definitely want to make sure that you're, out there, you're in front of it, you're communicating information on a regular basis. Sometimes you might even have to give an update where there's really no new information to report, but you just want to get a message out there so that people don't think that there's, something wrong or that, or start speculating. So yeah, cadence is definitely important. So you want to keep it up. Maybe, depending on what kind of emergency notification system you're using, you might have different modes of communication that you can use. And sometimes it's text, voice calls, emails, social media. Really, maybe in the beginning, you're casting a wider net and using more of those modes. And maybe as you advance through an incident, you start scaling back to maybe just text and email. So it's not as, it's not as intrusive. But again, regular communication from an official source is always important.
Great. And I want to ask you about the stakeholders. When we've talked before about this, you've mentioned using a toolbox approach with your stakeholders. Can you tell me more about what that toolbox approach means, and how it relates to how you build a team who can respond to an incident as complex as the Boston Marathon bombing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like I said, it's important to have a lot of tools in the toolbox because you never know what type of incident is going to present. And in this case study with, the Boston Marathon bombings, situational awareness is key right now because there's so much activity going on, so many different entities that are involved in the response. Everything from EMS to fire to hazmat to FBI, local police, state police, emergency management agencies. It's so important that you have those relationships and connections in advance to get that information so that you can synthesize that messaging that you're going to be sending out to folks, and also know what types of response is going to be required by your organization. So on a college campus, what type of movement is going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed. If you're a business, similar concerns, right? Those are just some, relationships that would have been key and important during this particular incident. But just from an all hazard standpoint, looking at anything that could strike your organization, just getting to know like I said, all those players that are involved in the organization. So, looking at, strong partnerships with your communications folks. So people who handle external communications, internal communications, your public information officer, your social media person. Great team to have, built and trained and, and bringing them together on a frequent basis to talk through types of responses to incidents. That's one of the key groups that you bring into, say, an emergency operations center. Human resources is another strong partner just because of the human impact. Not only dealing with labor issues, but also looking at, employee assistance programs that might need to be offered depending on the nature of the incident. Facilities, security, law enforcement, fire service, hazmat, everything from, your legal department, your compliance department. There's so many, your IT department, you're even looking at the people who may provide your housing and dining. Those are a couple key stakeholders just because of what services might be needed in a long duration incident, and or feeding and housing is a concern. So you have them all in the toolbox. The incident presents itself, and like anything else, your EOC is scalable. So you pull the tools out of the toolbox as they're needed to effectively respond to that incident, and then doesn't mean you're going to activate every one of them, for that particular incident, but at least they're there, they're engaged, there's a relationship, and they understand their role during a crisis.
Great. And now I want to ask you about the role of your emergency notification system, specifically around, how much you pre-planned the alerts and, how you used it to broadcast your lockdown strategy.
Yeah. So, okay. So again, incident like the marathon, right? Potentially, you're going to be locking down the campus. You're going to be communicating, special conditions that might be at play. Again, when cities are locked down, transportation's unavailable, et cetera. So, kind of a similar approach to building those key relationships in advance of an incident. What you probably want to do is work with those key stakeholders, especially your probably your communications folks within the organization, to develop scenarios that you're going to respond to in terms of, maybe pre-scripted communications, notification groups are important too to kind of build in advance. Do you have groups of key stakeholders like your senior leadership of the organization? Maybe you have your emergency management team is a pre-built group. You might have, your core team of just the people you work with on your own emergency management team, your own, emergency management department. Maybe you have representatives from all the different academic areas or business units that you might want to have on a group so that you can communicate specifically to them. And then, of course, you're going to have your entire population that you're going to want to communicate with. So those are, so again, the role of the ENS there is really, from a planning standpoint, is really just to ensure that you have all of these, kind of scenarios mapped out and really kind of figure out for the most part what your communication strategy is when those incidents present. Saves you a lot of time and effort when, especially when time is of the most importance once the incident presents. Looking at your, in addition to the pre-scripting and pre-building of groups, it's looking at what types of modes you'd like to communicate via. Obviously, emergency notification systems have lots of capabilities, and knowing what type of modes you're going to use in a particular incident or situation is important as well. So you're not, you're not overusing the system, and causing people to tune out, but you're not, obviously, but you're using the right modes to capture people's attention when you really need to, and when the situation is extreme. So those are just some things that I would be doing in advance of an incident, to make sure that I'm ready to effectively alert.
And you mentioned working with a virtual EOC throughout this incident. Were the internal stakeholders that you mentioned earlier the same ones that you bring into this virtual EOC when an incident is actually taking place?
Yeah, so an EOC, it's a function. Doesn't necessarily need to be a location, or a physical location or virtual. I mean, it takes many different shapes and sizes. I would say that many organizations want to be as flexible and resilient as possible. So an EOC in the traditional sense is a room. It's probably got a bunch of tables and chairs that you can move around. It has AV equipment in it. It's got phones, internet access, maybe some computers. I mean, that's what most people probably on the line that do this type of work envision as an EOC. I would challenge that, there's some situations that call for something a little bit more flexible and virtual. So it's just leveraging, technology that you might already have in place, from conference lines, WebEx, Skype. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that you could leverage to assemble that group of key stakeholders together, and work on the incident. So, in this type of situation, when you have a situation that's active, in the city of Boston, and there's, limited movement, and there's obviously a dangerous situation. Last thing I'd want to do is have people respond into a specific location. So I think using a virtual emergency operations center is definitely a great option, in a situation like this, or any other situation where, movement may be limited, or there's a component where safety, your safety could be compromised, should you have to respond to that specific location. Having done this for almost 15 years, emergency management, nothing ever replaces fully face-to-face contact and face-to-face interaction. But definitely having the contingency for a virtual EOC is definitely a best practice that no matter what organization I'm in, is important. It's something that I try to do.
And you've talked so much about planning and the pre-scripting of alerts and the toolbox that you're putting together with these stakeholders. When it comes to the plan versus how an incident plays out in the real world, was there anything that that you felt unprepared for?
Oh gosh, yeah. So planning versus real world. So 99% of what we do in emergency management, business continuity, is, I guess is planning. It's building relationships. It's it's conducting exercises, tabletops, right? From a planning standpoint, we build we build plans. We test those plans. We compile information. Really, the purpose is to raise awareness. It's to enlighten. It's to help folks, who are our partners. I mean, most emergency management organizations and business continuity organizations are very small. Usually, they're only a couple people, depending on the size of the organization. So we depend heavily on those key partnerships, and a lot of times you have those dotted line representatives in each of your business units, or that you interact with, and they're the subject matter experts on their particular area of expertise or their particular organization. So they know what needs to be done in order to do their their critical business functions. So working with them, helping them understand why business continuity, emergency preparedness is important. will yield in just having simple tabletop exercises where you go through scenarios. Yeah, at first they'll start having, they'll build the plans and they'll have the plans in front of them, but then quickly they kind of get what we're trying to do, and then the plan becomes more of a reference. So the hope is that, a well-oiled, successful emergency management business continuity program conducts planning, has plans. Those plans contain valuable information, but your employees and your stakeholders and your are so well rehearsed that they're able to do things, without necessarily referring to the plans or following the plans exactly. Because when the real world situation presents itself, sometimes you're just sometimes things are thrown at you that you didn't necessarily plan for. I mean, you really can't plan or create an SOP for every type of incident or every type of situation that you might be faced with. So you really need folks who are able to see the bigger picture, understand the value, understand what the mission is, use the plans as references, and to contain that key documentation. But really, the goal of a successful program is really to be able to adapt and to respond to a situation regardless of how it presents.
And one interesting wrinkle for you about planning versus the real world is that all of a sudden you were seeing your alerts, the alerts that you were sending out, kind of turn up on the local news. Does that change how you write them or anything about them to realize that they've become so public?
Yeah, I mean, with emergency notification systems that leverage social media, especially, you're putting out information that the whole world can see, right? So it is not uncommon for local news agencies to actually follow, those type of emergency alerts. So I think it raises the bigger issue of just or an awareness that what you put out there to the public, you just have to be aware of it, and that people are seeing this information. They're rebroadcasting this information. So it's just important that what you put out there is accurate, it's timely, and that it's effective in doing what you want it to do, because there are people watching, and I think it kind of hits home when you are sending out alerts. I mean, we see it all the time on the news now. When people are covering school shootings or other major incidents, the first thing the media is looking at is Facebook and Twitter to get real-time information. So I think it's just a reality of the world we live in today, and it's just something to be aware of and to be conscious of if you're the person that's crafting and sending emergency alerts.
And you've mentioned before when it comes to messaging fundamentals that you have this kind of three main questions that you want to address for people when you're sending out alerts. Can you just describe that strategy for the audience?
Yeah, when I send out alerts, or when I'm pre-scripting alerts, or just preparing to send alerts, I generally look at it as, okay, what is it, where is it, and how can you protect yourself? Those are the three things I try to communicate in an emergency alert, because you need to know what it is, right? Where is it, and what can you do to protect yourself? So is it I don't know, we have a sinkhole, right in the middle of Main Street, okay? Avoid the area, or detour around it. I mean, just because if you're missing one of those pieces of information, it's hard for that alert to be really effective. So you might know there's a sinkhole, but you don't know where it is, and you can tell people to avoid it, but if they don't know where it is, how can that be successful? If you know that there's a problem, okay, yeah, we know there's something going on over on Main Street, want you to avoid the area. It's a little bit more helpful. Or you just say there's a sinkhole, it's on Main Street, and then you're not kind of giving them any other directions to follow from there. Okay, do you detour? Can you still get around the sinkhole? I don't know. Those are the things that I like to communicate. And obviously in an act of violence, or you might have an active shooter situation. In those situations, those pieces of information are critical, because you need to know what it is, where is it, and how do you protect yourself, because you don't want somebody to be running into harm's way. So you might go with the run, hide, fight. Well, if you're running, but you're running into the scene of the incident, it's not going to be too helpful. So at that point, by knowing the location, you might be better off locking down or hiding in that situation. Those things aren't necessarily linear, so they don't follow each other. You need to be prepared to do one of those three things at any given time, depending on where you are in relation to that incident. So, looking at our, looking at a situation like that, it just, that's, for me, those are the things that are important. And then, of course, once you've got that message crafted, you've really got to take into consideration who your audience is. So you got the message, who's your audience, and then what mode you're going to send it on. And if you can satisfy those three things as well, so now you get your message, you feel your message is adequate, it provides the right information, then looking at who your audience is going to be, and then how you're going to send it to them. That's really, those are the things that I look at.
And I want to ask you a little bit more about how you're going to send it to them question. How do you choose the right channel to alert people on? And is there any reason not to send a critical alert on as many channels as possible?
Yeah, again, early on in the incident, especially if it's a life safety incident, my preference is to cast as wide a net as possible, because you don't know what types of modes are going to be available to people at any given time. You might have somebody who has internet access, but they're out of cell service, for example. So maybe texting wouldn't be effective, or a voice call wouldn't be effective, but broadcasting something on Twitter or Facebook, might reach them because they have an internet connection. So there's a wisdom kind of to say, okay, well, if it's life safety, we're going to cast as wide a net as possible, managing expectations that, sending a message is still dependent upon, third-party infrastructure, right? There's all these different variables that could cause you not to get that alert, or get it late or something. So that's but I think in general, though, that's really where having your emergency management team meeting on a regular basis, especially with the communication specialist within the organization, you can kind of pre-plan that out. So for this type of incident, this is the way in general we're going to communicate it, right? Depending on the level of severity. So that's where the work in advance, I think, would pay off. But then you look at it as, simple philosophy of, who needs to see this message, and who needs to get this message, and what is the best way to deliver that message to them.
And when it comes to this alerting, how do you decide who's actually authorized to send the alerts?
Yeah, so that's always a tricky one. So, and again, I've worked in multiple organizations, and it seems like everybody kind of has a different flavor of how that kind of pans out. So in some organizations, that responsibility is held by the emergency management department. So they would have emergency management director, or some staff members who had access to the system, and they'd be the ones that are on call to send out that message. Some organizations have a 24-hour warning point. So it could be a campus police, it could be a security office, it could be maybe some sort of facilities office that is available 24/7, that has the access to that technology, that they can send the alerts and the training. So it really kind of runs the gamut. My preference is, if possible, and again, not every organization is fortunate enough to have, these type of services, but I prefer if it's a 24-hour organization, or warning point or operations center that has, that they have the technology in front of them, they have the connectivity in front of them, and they have the training and the experience. That's my preference, because that minimizes some of the variables that could impact a successful communication. Going on the on-call system, it's a little challenging because, first of all, you have to get a hold of the people who are on call. Then sometimes, depending on the tools that they're using, they have to spin up their communications tools, which adds time. So definitely having somebody in place that's sitting there and available to send a message is preferred as far as I'm concerned.
And when it comes to the messages that you have to, that you weren't able to pre-script, the ones that you have to send in the moment, do you try and get a second set of eyes on them, or do you just feel confident that you've accomplished what you need to and send them out as quickly as possible?
Yeah, whenever possible, that's great. Sometimes that initial message, especially if you're an on-call, an individual's on call that's sending out alerts, sometimes there's just not the time for that. But certainly would prefer having somebody who can kind of look over your shoulder and proofread the message. That's always a great resource to have. So in an emergency operations center environment, that's something that you might have. You might have a few folks in there, and one person can kind of look over your shoulder as you're typing, and it may take an extra couple seconds, but it's going to ensure that the message goes out and it's accurate and it contains all the information that it needs to contain to be successful. So whenever possible, that's something I like to do, especially when it's something that's super not time sensitive. Just ensure that you're putting out the right message to the right people.
And after a big incident like this, where you've activated your EOC, I guess I have two questions about this. Like, first, in the incident that we're doing the case study on now, were there any ways that you changed your strategy? And then, like, a second question: how do you come back together, to do an after action review after something like this has taken place, to like really pull out those learnings that are going to help you improve next time?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so obviously, we'll answer the first question first. So anytime you have a major incident like this, I mean, obviously this is Boston Marathon bombing, huge incident. It's something that really, captured the world's attention. Certainly, there's a lot of lessons learned to come out of an event like that. Many times when organizations run drills and exercises, they're great, but it's a controlled environment and you kind of know what the outcome's going to be. You might find a few lessons learned and corrective actions that you're going to implement, but there's nothing, that compares to a real life situation with all the unexpected twists and turns of a situation like that, to really challenge and test your emergency management, emergency response structure. So it's always important to try and capture those corrective actions and those lessons learned, preferably as quickly as possible after the incident, just because it's fresh in people's minds. Sometimes people tend to move on or to forget some of those things that happen. So what I like to do inside of an EOC is always have either a screen open or an area on the whiteboard or a flip chart where you can just capture those lessons learned real time, just because it's fresh, it's in the moment, and it's relevant, and you risk, the further away from the incident you go, you risk losing that valuable information. That's information that's just going to help you in the future, and it's going to help improve your process and your program. So, lots to learn from a real life incident. Again, it's the best test of your plans and procedures and your emergency response. And from an after action standpoint, try to do that as quickly as possible, given the situation after the event.
Thanks. And I also want to ask you what advice you have. What things have you learned going through, some of these large events that you would want to pass on to people who are, starting to build their plans, or maybe, kind of a mid-level maturity with their plan?
Yeah, I can't stress enough collaboration. An emergency management business continuity program can't operate in a silo. It heavily relies on partnership with all different stakeholders across the organization. Knowing what the role is of an emergency management and business continuity program during an actual event, how that team is there to support the boots on the ground efforts of the first responders who are actually responding to that scene. So, making sure that mission is clear and that mission is well understood and active. Breaking down silos. Sometimes silos exist within organizations. So having again, building those other relationships with key stakeholders helps to break down some of the silos. So yeah, those are some of the things that I personally look to achieve when I go into a new organization or assist somebody who's actually setting up a new program, is just get out there. I mean, the less time you spend at your desk, the better. You should be kind of just walking around your entire organization, getting to meet people, getting to know people, and building those relationships, because they're going to pay off dividends, because everybody brings something different and unique to the table, and you never know when that particular resource is going to be needed and come in handy during an actual response.
And I want to close out here by asking you about what surprised you most when you were, running this incident. Is there anything about the community, about working with real people, that surprised you?
Yeah, working with real people, I guess it's you never know. You never know how things are going to play out until the actual incident occurs. But I think that as we saw with the Boston Marathon incident, it's I guess humbling to see how people rally in support and come together in a situation like that, as tragic as it is and as as disruptive as it is. Just the human spirit will shine through, and that's always again humbling to see. In terms of how people would respond to an emergency, everybody responds primarily a lot of times to what their training is. So that's why it's so important to conduct frequent drills, exercises, meetings, so that people build a certain muscle memory in responding and managing incidents like this. So you kind of reduce or you minimize some of the surprises. But like anything else, you're going to have people who and regardless of the incident, who are going to step up, and they're going to be extremely strong and go above and out of their way, probably more than you'd expect. And there's going to be some people that may not live up to expectation. And I think that's just a reality of human beings, and that's something that I've seen happen in many incidents that I've worked. Is that you're going to have people that are really going to shine and step up, and then some that just may not pull the weight that you thought they'd pull. So yeah, those are some surprises. But I definitely believe that the more engaged your program is and the more active your program is, you certainly minimize the amount of surprises that you're going to encounter during an incident.
I loved what you just said about that when you fall back on your training, that it should be like a muscle memory. That seems like a lofty goal, but one that everyone should be working towards.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier inside the the presentation, is that the whole point of like I said, the 99% of the time when the program is not responding to an incident, it's building the relationships. It's conducting that pre-planning, right? Because the hope is that your program is so functional and well-oiled that you don't even need to take the plan off the shelf, because people just know what to do and how to respond and how to adapt. So that's really the hallmark of a really, really good emergency management business continuity program, where you don't have to pull that plan off the shelf. It's there. It's a reference. It took a lot of effort to pull that plan together, and a lot of engagement to pull that plan together. And, it's a valuable process that you undertook, and you learn a lot in it. But, if you don't have to pull it off the shelf and you know exactly what to do and how to respond, that's a great program in my book.
Awesome. I love it. And Jeff, I love talking to you about how confident and together you are, because I feel like every contingency you've already thought all of them out. And it's always such a pleasure to speak with you. So thank you so much for this presentation. I'm going to open the floor now to questions. I think we've already had a couple come in, so I'll begin with those. But if you have any questions, just type them into the question box, and we're going to get to as many as we can today. So the first question is, what other communication methods would you recommend if phone and email are unavailable?
Okay, so phone and email are unavailable. So, going back to the casting the wide net, right? So looking at, within your organization, if you have any type of public address capabilities, those are always, easy, effective methods to communicate. A lot of times organizations will have a phone system where you dial a number and you can access an intercom. In a community, maybe you have law enforcement who have PAs inside their cruisers. Those are always good to utilize as well. Internet. Obviously email's down, so let's say maybe your organization's having a business continuity situation and you lose email. In that case, maybe I'll use a text message to get to them, because maybe it's your Outlook's down or your Exchange server's down, So there's all these different things, but again, it's having all of these different modes that enable you to respond and kind of deliver the message to whatever mode is available to the audience you're looking to speak to.
Great. And another question here: how many people were on your emergency communications committee?
Yeah. So, and again, this is no matter what organization I've ever worked, there's always seems to be a flavor of this. Usually there's somebody who handles public information, right? So usually there's a spokesperson for the organization. There's usually somebody that handles internal communication, right? Employee communication, community communication. There's usually an external communications person, right? That represents the face of the organization to the public. There's usually somebody who handles social media, right? And web and other things like that. So you try to bring all those folks together, and I always call it a communications, team or communications section. And me personally, I tend to have more frequent meetings with that group, just because of how critical their role is, especially early on in an incident, right? So they need to get in front of this. We also help them work on things like setting up media staging areas, right? Things that you might not necessarily think about when everything is going well, right? Where are you going to put all the media that's going to respond to your place of business if there's an active shooter event, let's say, for example? Think about that in advance, because the last thing you want is the media hindering a response, right? So you don't want them blocking access to your facility. Also, joint information centers, right? Looking at how to build relationships with the spokespersons from different responding agencies, so that you can speak with one single common message. So those are definitely some things that you want to talk about with that committee well in advance. Who's going to be the spokesperson? How to get a hold of that spokesperson if something happens at 1 a.m, right? So yeah, those are the kind of people, and organizations of different sizes have maybe more people that are assigned to those functions. Some places maybe it's one person that's handling all those different functions. So whatever the arrangement is at your organization, definitely want to get all those functions in a room, even if it's only one person, to pre-plan with.
And for a company who does not have an existing plan, what resources can you recommend as a starting point, like a template or a sample?
Okay, so like for an emergency response plan or a business continuity plan, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I don't have the context.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I would say for any type of plan, emergency plan, there are plenty of resources that are out there. Obviously, FEMA has great guidance that they can share. There are professional organizations like DRI that's got some great, professional practices that you can look at, that'll kind of give you what a good program, entails, and what should be included in your plan. There's so many resources out there. Start with your local community. Is there a emergency management office or director? Maybe it's on a county level, depending on where you're from. State Office of Emergency Management. They're all willing to help. And it doesn't matter if you're private sector, public sector, whatever, nonprofit. It doesn't matter, because they're there for everybody's preparedness. So reach out to those offices, and I'm sure there's somebody there that would be more than happy to give you a hand and kind of provide you with planning guidance that's reflective of the jurisdictions, their rules and regulations.
Perfect. And I guess that takes me into, I wanted to let you guys know that we just released a new tool, speaking of planning, that helps you, that asks you 10 questions and grades your emergency preparedness plan for active shooters, and then based on 10 specific success factors for an active shooter preparedness plan. And for each question, it's going to take your results and give you concrete steps to improve, to help keep the people at your business or your organization or your campus safe. So this is available on our website, alertfind.com. We also sent you an email about it a couple of days ago, so you probably already have it in your inbox, but I can't overstate how proud we are of this thing. It's the advice is really, really detailed and incredible, and we're just we think that it could be really useful for everyone on the call to help them build their emergency preparedness plans. I also want to let you guys know that we'll be sending out an invitation to our next webinar. It's going to be on May the 10th with Bob Clark, and also about communicating during a crisis. Social media, friend or foe, don't let your online communications create a crisis. Bob is a complete expert on the subject. He has a lot of great anecdotes to tell you guys about social media strategies gone terribly wrong, and also ones that have succeeded. So excited for you guys to join us on May 10th to talk about that. And then one last thing, I want to mention that AlertFind, we are an emergency notification system for business continuity professionals. You can see it in action by requesting a demo through our website. You can email me to request a demo, or you can just give us a call anytime. And I want to thank you so much, Jeff. You shared so much with us today. All of your information has been incredibly, detailed and tactical, and I appreciate it so much. So thank you. Thank you for joining us and for battling your cold.
Oh, no. Yeah, again, thank you for allowing me to share this information.
It's been so valuable. And I also want to let you guys know that we're going to be sending out a recording of this webinar to you. It will come through tomorrow, and it will come through with a link to download an ebook that Jeff has written for us about communication alerting strategy, so that it rounds up some of what we talked about here, but has more tactical specifics. So for anyone who's looking to build a plan, looking to pre-plan their alerts, this ebook is a great resource, and it'll be in your inbox tomorrow. So thanks again, Jeff. Thanks to everyone who joined us, and we will see you on May 10th. Thank you.